Okay, so welcome to lecture 7. And for those that are watching this recorded version on YouTube, I apologize at lecture 6. I neglected to hit the record button. It was probably one of my favorite ones, but it'll have to remain in the minds of those that were here last week, and I apologize for that. Where we're going to start from is we're going to start from the I'm going to put up a link right now in the chat. Give me 1 second. For those that are following in the Safaria online, I just put up a link in the chat, and basically it's Guide for the Perplexed, the introduction, prefatory remarks. And if you scroll down, you'll see there's a paragraph number 15. Right after paragraph number 15, in the Hebrew, it says Savoat Zehamamar, which means instructions, a guide to how to read this book. And then if you scroll past the Hebrew, the English starts directions for the study of this work. So the Rambam is telling you how he wants you to study his book if you're going to read it. In the Pines version, it's page 15 in the volume 1, and it says instruction with respect to this treatise. So that's where we will begin, and this I hope that this time we finish this instruction plus another introduction, and then so that next lecture we can actually get into the meat of the book and start with chapter 1. I'm gonna basically read from the Pines. I might flip to the Hebrew Kapach version here and there, and if you try to follow along in the Safaria, which is the Friedlander translation, then you'll hopefully be able to follow, even though the words might change some things. So basically, so the Rambam is going to tell us how to read this book. So if you wish to grasp the totality of what this treatise contains, so that nothing of it will escape you, you must connect its chapters one with another. So basically, he's saying, don't think that you can read one chapter, understand that topic, and now you know everything you need to know about that topic. Rather, you need to read the whole book, and you need to understand that there are many things in each chapter that connects to other things in other places. And when you read a given chapter, your intention must not be only to understand the totality of the subject of that chapter, but also to grasp each word that occurs in it in the course of the speech. So while I'm explaining to you a certain concept, the Rambam is saying, I will also put out some ideas and some words and some phrases that I want you to take note of. So don't think that just because you got the whole concept, you can ignore a line of mine or a sentence of mine, but rather for the diction of even if that word does not belong to the intention of the chapter, even if you think that what I'm writing there isn't necessary to understand the whole thing. For the diction of this treatise has not been chosen at haphazard. If I threw a concept in there, it wasn't at random. I put it in there because I believe that it's important for you to understand. And what the Rambam is really trying to protect us from is from the danger of thinking we know what he's saying and then reading through it. Now, I remember when I learned in yeshiva, this was a mistake that we often would make when we're reading the words of any of the great scholars of the past. When you start reading it and then you think you know the concept, and then everything else you read, you kind of flow through it and you just fit it into whatever you already think the concept is. Rambam is warning you, don't do that. Be careful. Don't think you get it until you read every single word. With care to avoid failing to explain any obscure point. Don't think that you can read the whole thing, and if you missed one sentence, well, you still understood the basic point. No, it doesn't work that way, because in that obscure point might be the meaning that's really, really important. And nothing has been mentioned out of its place, save with the view to explaining some matter in its proper place. Occasionally, I might, if I mention something, it's because I want to explain something. Therefore, you should not let your fantasies elaborate on what is said here, for that would hurt me and be of no use to yourself. Don't start elaborating and saying what you think I said until you understand every single word, because you might be making a big mistake, and then you're going to go around quoting me, Maimonides, and that's not what I meant. So you're not doing me a good service, and you're not doing yourself a service because you don't get the point that I'm trying to make. You ought rather learn everything that ought to be learned and constantly study this treatise. You have to learn it, and you have to read it carefully and read it thoroughly and read it again if you have to, until you understand everything that I'm saying, and then you know exactly what I mean. And this reminds me of many of the conversations I've had in the past with people who very much misunderstand the Rambam. And then if you argue with them about what the Rambam really said, and you show them what it says inside, they look at a passage that you're arguing about, and they tell you, oh, this passage really means this and this and this and this. But what Maimonides is saying, that that's not how you can't read my book that way. If you don't read the whole thing, then you don't understand it at all. So don't try to read 5 lines. And since you could explain it however you want to, therefore I said what you think I said. It doesn't work that way. For it will then elucidate for you most of the obscurities of the, but if you do read it and constantly read it, like I'm saying, then you will gain what you're supposed to gain from this book. For it then will elucidate for you most of the obscurities of the law that appear as difficult to every intelligent man. Because if you do pay attention, then when you're going to find things in the Torah that are very difficult to understand, you will find that I will explain it to you. So I will keep my promise. You keep your, I'm asking you to promise that you're careful when you read it. So I'm keeping my promise to you. Rambam is saying that if you do read it carefully, you will gain understanding into things that you always found difficult. Then Rambam says, I adjure by God, may he be exalted, every reader of this treatise of mine, not to comment upon a single word of it, and not to explain to another anything in it. I'm going to describe, actually, before I finish reading the sentence from the Pines translation, I'm going to tell you what he's going to say. I did this last time. What the Rambam is about to say is that if you quote me and you teach me, this is how I want you to teach what I said. Take any chazal, any word of what the rabbi said in the past, or any word from the prophets, or any part of the Torah, see how I explained it, and then it's okay for you to teach my ideas, to say, this is how Maimonides explained this concept. As long as you're quoting, that's good. But if you're going to try to say something that I said myself, Maimonides says, and try to explain that, you're going to mess it up. So don't try. You're just going to make problems. So maybe as we go through the book, when we get to the meat of the book, we can understand what he means. But since he so often, almost always, writes this book as if he's explaining, he gets his own ideas out there by using it to explain the words of Chazal, by using the words of previous scholars and words of often secular philosophers. This isn't going to be that big of a problem, because we're always going to be able to teach what Maimonides says by making it depend on a statement from someone else. This is what he's about.
I've been listening to the Audible on Guide for the Perplexed, and I'm in the spheres, kind of where they're talking about spheres, and you start thinking ahead. So it's about, where this could be going. Is he admonishing us not to do that and just sort of hold on and not draw any conclusions? As what we're reading?
Yeah, well, he's kind of saying, don't draw conclusions until you read everything, which is a big challenge because it's going to take a very long time to read everything. But I'll tell you that most people don't listen to this admonishment from Maimonides, and they read, myself included. I mean, I read something and then I go ahead and I tell people what Maimonides said, right? So, but that is kind of what he's saying, that you can't explain, don't think you got it until you read the whole thing, and then keep reading it and you'll see more and more. So every reader, so he beseeches us that not to comment upon a single word of it and not to explain to another anything in it, save that which has been explained and commented upon in the words of the famous sages of our law who preceded me. But whatever he understands from this treatise of those things that have not been said by any of our famous sages other than myself should not be explained to another. In other words, when I speak on my own, don't think you understand what I'm saying. If you're going to talk to someone else, explain how I explained the words of the sages. One gets the sense that the Rambam wants us to, he doesn't, if we were to say things, teach things in his name, many of these concepts are very controversial. So if we were to say it that way, and we would say Maimonides says this, this, and this, and this, and someone who finds it controversial would get all upset. That can't be. What is Maimonides saying? And they're going to think he's some kind of a heretic, God forbid, right? So Maimonides is saying, as long as you stick with using my words as explanations of what the Chazal said, so then he protects himself from that accusation because he's explaining Chazal. Chazal said it. The rabbi said it, not Maimonides. Maimonides was just explaining it. So he's beseeching us not to do that. And then, and kind of because this is what's on his mind now, whatever he nor should he hasten to refute me. Don't jump and argue on what I said and say that I'm wrong, because for that which he understood me to say might be contrary to my intention. If you're going to quote me alone and not use the explanations that I give to the words of Chazal, then what you're criticizing is probably not what I really said. So don't do that. He thus would harm me, Maimonides is concerned, in return for my having wanted to benefit him. I'm trying to teach you, and he would repay evil for good. So your Mishalim Roa Tachastova is a phrase, well-known phrase. And basically, if you're going to quote me alone and you're going to misquote me and then you're going to refute me, people will think I said something I didn't say, and Maimonides is afraid of that. And that, of course, happens all the time. And unfortunately, I probably have been guilty of it myself here and there, but we just have to be careful. So all into whose hands it falls should consider it well. And now anyone that grabs a hold of my book and decides to read it, think about it, everyone. So even if you're not one of the intelligent, educated ones that I told you I'm writing the book for several times already, if it slakes his thirst, in other words, it does it for you, though it be on only one point from among the many other obscure, even if I manage throughout this entire book to explain you only one thing that you didn't understand before, then he should thank God and be content with what he has understood. Then great, I accomplished something, I taught you something, you learned something, everybody went home happy. However, and this is a very often quoted phrase here, if on the other hand he finds nothing in this treatise that might be of use to him in any respect, you read through it and you don't understand what it's trying to tell you and you don't get it, you think of it as not having been composed at all. Then just forget the book, put it away, leave it alone, and don't bother. If anything in it, according to his way of thinking, appears in some way harmful. Now, if you read something here and you think this is some heresy and they don't like it for that reason, then, but you have a choice to interpret it in several ways, then please interpret it even in a far-fetched way in order to pass a favorable judgment. Assume that I meant something that makes more sense rather than assume that I meant something that makes less sense. For we are enjoined, because in general we are assumed we should always take the benefit of doubt, even towards people that are not so educated, even towards our vulgar ones. All the more so should this be so with respect to our erudite ones. And Maimonides is calling himself an erudite one here. So take note of that. He realizes that he's a scholar. So if people that are not scholars, we should assume the best. And certainly I, writing this book, and certainly the sages of our law, the rabbis in general, who are trying to help us to the truth as they apprehend it, whose the point of their writings is to teach us the truth, certainly you should always assume the best. Now, I know that, Maimonides says, among men generally, every beginner will derive benefit from some of the chapters of this treatise, though he lacks even an inkling of what is involved in speculation. Even if you're not so educated, and here Maimonides is just giving us, all of us, who are really just beginners, he's giving us permission to read this book. He's emphasizing it again. Remember, he's saying this because he has told us before that he's not writing this book for simple people, but now he's telling us specifically the opposite. So I remember in yeshiva being told millions of times not to study this book because Maimonides says it's only for the people that are advanced and so on. But meanwhile, Maimonides wrote the book and he specifically contradicted himself. And contradictions is something that Maimonides is going to address in a moment. And it's not coincidental that he contradicted himself several times in just the few lectures that we had. And he's going to explain to us how to deal with contradictions in a moment, right before he begins the book. But the truth is that Maimonides says that even those that are not that educated will find things in here that are valuable to them, and they will get use from. Now, a perfect man, but of someone who's truly well educated and knows science, knows Torah, knows philosophy, and really has it all down. Such a person, on the other hand, who's devoted to law, in other words, he keeps the Torah, he's perfect in every way, both morally and intellectually, as I mentioned, but however, he's perplexed. He's perplexed by those difficulties which we have been discussing in the previous lectures, perplexed by the contradictions between what he knows to be true and what he seems to see in the Torah. That person will benefit from all its chapters. He or she will read this book and they'll really get it. How greatly will he rejoice in them, and how pleasant will it be to hear them. He or she will look at this book and will be completely blown away by all the wonderful things I have to say. But those who are confused, however, so that's good for anyone that's truly searching truth, whether you're highly educated or not so educated. However, if you are one of those who are confused and messed up with false ideas, Maimonides' words here in the Pines is, but those who are confused and whose brains have been polluted by false opinions and misleading ways, however deemed to them by them to be true scientists, people that are messed up and they have all kinds of crazy ideas, and they think that those ideas are real, those and who hold themselves to be men of speculation, and they think of themselves as being smart, but they're not, without having any knowledge of anything that can truly be called science, those will flee from many of his chapters. But if you are deluding yourself into thinking that you're smart, then you're going to look at this book and you're going to run away. It's going to scare you and you're not going to like it. Literally, you will run away, Maimonides says, from my book. Indeed, these chapters will be very difficult for them to bear. They won't be able to stomach it. They're going to look at these chapters and they won't be able to take it. Indeed, these chapters will be very difficult for them to bear because they cannot apprehend their meaning. They'll never understand the meaning. They are not even perplexed, and they don't understand why I have to say what I'm saying. And also, because they would be led to recognize the falseness of the counterfeit money in their hands. If they read what I say and take it seriously, then it would contradict all those false ideas, that notions that they already have in their mind, and their treasure and fortune held ready for future calamity. They'll realize that all the money they had in their hand is counterfeit. All of the knowledge that they think they had was false to begin with, and they won't want to acknowledge them. God, may he be exalted, knows. And now Maimonides turns to God before he gets to the meat of the book, and he says, God knows that my intentions here were completely 100% for God's sake, for the sake of truth, for the sake of honesty. God knows, and we get the sense, and we've gotten the sense over all this last lectures, the series of lectures that we've had, that Maimonides is truly scared, like that what he's about to write is going to really blow people's minds. And it's going to really question what some people really hold dear to their hearts. And it's going to cause controversy. He knows it's going to cause controversy. So he's declaring again, and he's saying, God knows that I have never ceased to be exceedingly apprehensive. I have been careful about setting down those things that I wish to set down in this treatise. I didn't just willy-nilly decide to write controversial things. I chose them carefully, and I chose them because I felt that they were important to be taught. For they are concealed things. These are things that not everyone knows or understands. None of them has been set down in any book. No one has ever, Maimonides is telling us, no one, and this is true, no one has ever written a book like this before, written in the religious community in these times of exile. None of the other Torah writers that preceded me have dared write these things. So the books composed in these times being in our hands, of all the books that we have in front of us, how then can I now innovate and set them down? How could we do something new, something different, Maimonides says? No one has written it before me. One imagines that he probably had Rabbi Saadia Gaon, for one example, in mind, who was also well known as a rationalist, and did write, here and there ideas that are kind of pre-Maimonidean. But he didn't set this all down in an organized and open way like the Maimonides did in this book. So how can I innovate? So however, I have relied on two premises. The reason why I'm doing this is for two reasons. One being, as the sages, as the rabbi said, it is time to do something for the God. In other words, that's said famously in the Talmud, why the Rabbi Judah, the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, decided to write down the Mishnah, even though it's supposed to be oral law. Why was the oral tradition written if it's meant to be oral? So the idea is, sometimes you have to do something for God's glory, because even though it contradicts previous traditions, previous rules and laws. And Maimonides says, even though until now no one dared write this stuff, I have to do it because someone's got to write it, and I'm doing it for God's sake. The second reason is, let all thy acts be for the sake of heaven. Do everything you do lishma, do everything for the proper purposes, and I am doing this for the proper purpose, Maimonides says. Upon these two premises, because of these two reasons, because of Eit Lasos Lashem, I'm doing it for God's glory. And number two, because my purpose in doing it is the proper purpose, therefore I relied when I set down what I have composed in some of the chapters of the treatise. So Maimonides is protecting himself at this point from those who would criticize him for, why have you decided to write these things? To sum up, and this is the end of his instructions on how to read the book, I am the man who, when the concern pressed him, in other words, when I was really worried, I was worried about how people will be and are confused and perplexed, and his way was straightened, and he could find no other device. In other words, I had these concerns myself, but I, through my own study, Maimonides says, figured it out. I found a path, and the only way I could find with which to teach a demonstrated truth, other than by giving satisfaction to a single virtuous man while displeasing 10,000 ignoramuses, I had a choice. If I chose, I could only find one way to teach that one person who's truly educated and truly perplexed. At the same time, 10,000 people will read this book and get really upset about it, but they're the ignoramuses. I am he who prefers to address that single man by himself. I'd rather talk to that one smart guy, the one intelligent guy, the one honest person who's truly seeking the truth, and know that Maimonides says that at least I did my part to teach that person how to find the truth, right? And I do not heed the blame of those many creatures, and I don't care about how many ignoramuses are going to scream and yell and tell me that I did something terrible or that I didn't like it. For I claim to liberate, because my purpose is to liberate, literally, that virtuous one from that into which he has sunk. That virtuous one who truly is looking for the truth and is truly confused and perplexed, I shall guide him in his perplexity until he becomes perfect and he finds rest. It's worth it for me, Maimonides says, to teach that one person the truth and the way to the truth, then even though it means that 10,000 people are going to misunderstand what I say and get all angry and all huffy and puffy and scream and yell. So that ends that part of the introduction. And then he goes into the issue of contradictions, which I hope we can finish this tonight. So because Maimonides has told us all about being perplexed and all about the big contradiction. So Maimonides was a master he was a master of many, many things. But one of the things about him was his ability to take gigantic amounts of material and categorize them and line them up in a way and say this is A, B, C, and D, and that kind of sums up the whole thing. These principles sum up everything. I mean, if you think about the things that Maimonides is most famous for, he took a Jewish religion that had no official dogma, right? When Maimonides came around, there was no official statement of what do Jews believe, right? It was in a world where Christians were saying this and Muslims were saying that, and people said, well, what do the Jews believe? And the Jews there was no one, so Maimonides was able to take the entire corpus of Judaism and sum it up into 13 principles, 13 beliefs. The first person to ever do anything like that. And even that, of course, was controversial. Many of those things were never, some people argue on this one, some people argue on that one. Some people say Maimonides didn't even mean some of the things, but that's all subject for a different time. But the point being that he was able to take this gigantic amount of material and say, bottom line beliefs are these 13. And then he also took the entire body of rabbinic literature, of Torah law, and melt it down. Well, it's not melted down. The Mishnah Torah, which is literally review of the entire Torah, all of Jewish law, he organized and set up in topics and by chapter and so on. So his ability to do that, and remember, think about it, he was the first to ever accomplish anything like that, to take the entire Torah and make a book of Jewish law in an organized, set way. And that kind of led the way for the ability of everyone that followed him, to the Rush, to the Torah, to the Shulchan Aruch, to everyone ever since then who's written books like that. Similarly, to distill out of the Torah the Taryag mitzvos, the 613 mitzvot. The Rambam was not the first to list the 613, but he's certainly the most famous to list the 613. Anyway, now he's about to say, there's all kinds of contradictions that we're going to be trying to deal with in this book, and I'm going to lay them out in 7 types of contradictions, and here they are. There are 7 causes that account for contradictory or contrary statements to be found in any book or compilation. So Maimonides is telling us this is not just in the Torah, this is not just in the words of the rabbis, this is not just in the words of the prophets, and this is not just in the words of the scientists, philosophers, or other authors. But this is just the 7 types of contradictions that one can find. And as usual, Maimonides usually starts with the more simple ones and works his way up to the more difficult to resolve types of contradictions. So the first cause, what's the first type of contradiction? So the author, whoever it may be, whether it's the rabbi or a philosopher or any kind of author, has collected the remarks of various people with differing opinions. So, they collect, Rabbi so-and-so says this, Rabbi so-and-so says that, this philosopher says this philosopher says that, this scientist says this scientist says that, but he has omitted citing his authorities. But in the various places, he might make a quote without saying who the source of the quote is. So, and he has not attributed each remark to the one who said it. So therefore, contradictory or contrary statements can be found in such compilations because one of the 2 propositions is the opinion of one individual, while the other proposition is the opinion of another individual. Someone asked me, I think it was in the first lecture, about the Rambam contradicting himself. And I mentioned that, yes, there are contradictions to the Rambam himself. And I pointed that out tonight, where he seems to say that he's writing the book for only intelligent people, but then on numerous occasions, he throws in that anyone, even non-intelligent, non-educated people, will gain something from the book. So that's not this first type of contradiction that'll fit into one of the later categories, but it helps us understand why the Rambam is telling us about contradictions. So if you imagine you read a book that has a whole collection of opinions, they're 2 different opinions from 2 different people. They just weren't attributed correctly. So that's the first one. They're easy to resolve once you find out the source of each idea being written. The second one is also relatively easy to understand if the author of a particular book has adopted a certain opinion that he later rejects. So if you read a scientist who thought one way before he did various experiments, and then he did experiments and discovered something new, or he read a new book which had a much better explanation, later on in his life, he thinks something else, right? And this happens to all of us all the time, hopefully. If we're open-minded enough, we might be fixed in thinking X, Y, Z, and then we read a book and we realize, no, it's really ABC. So those, and both his original and later statements are retained in the book. So the contradiction can be answered simply by saying that so-and-so thought X, and then he did the proper research, and then he found out Y, and so on. So that would answer the contradiction. The third possible cause, which is also relatively straightforward, is when not all the statements in question are to be taken in their external sense. In other words, when you read a statement that seems to say A, and another statement that seems to say something contradictory, which is B, and they seem to be contradictory, it's not really the case, because A wasn't meant by its simple meaning. A was meant to convey something deeper, which is not contradictory to B. So some are to be taken in their external sense, while some others are parables and hence have an inner content. This is getting a little deeper, a little more. And this would explain, for example, why the Torah, for example, uses anthropomorphism, a little tongue twister, where if the Torah describes God as with an arm, and other places it said that God has no form, how do you explain? Well, clearly in one case, it's meant to describe God actually having an arm, but it's meant to describe his attribute of strength, etc., something like that. But and those will pop up as we go through the meat of the text of the Moreh Nevuchim. So the third cause is, alternatively, it could be that two apparently contradictory propositions may both be parables. Neither one may be meant what they say literally, and when taken in their external sense, they may contradict or be contrary to one another. But if you were to look a little deeper at to what they really mean to say, then they don't contradict each other. So the first three, in kind of descending order, are the first one is simple. They're not really contradictions. They're just two people have different opinions. The second one is you're getting a little deeper. You have to kind of get with it, because you have to realize that the person changed his mind based on some sort of evidence, right? But that's why they contradict. The third one is getting even deeper. No, you got to look more carefully at what you're looking at. Maybe it's not really contradiction. One of them might not mean exactly what you think it means. And then the fourth cause, it starts getting a little bit more intense, more complex. There is a proviso that because of a certain necessity has not been explicitly stated in its proper place. So in other words, there's an idea that for some reason or other, when a person expressed what he or she was trying to say, they didn't say it in depth. They didn't explain clearly what they meant, right? Or the two subjects may differ, but one of them has not been explained in its proper place, so that a contradiction appears to have been said, whereas there is no contradiction. So I explained something, right? And I want to convey a certain idea, but for some reason or other, I held something back. For some reason or other, I didn't explain it to its full depth. I'll go ahead. I see a hand up. Fire away.
So yeah, so what this reminds me a little bit of is some of the language that we find in Shas, in Mishnah and Gemara Talmud, where it says this and that, zelazeh and zelazeh, right? This and that, and this and that, and it's a seeming contradiction. And the way it's explained away in many cases is that there is some different context.
Yes, that's a very good example. Actually, Maimonides himself is going to bring that example as specifically to illustrate his fourth type. But you're right on target. Yeah, he's going to mention the sayings in Talmud that are exactly like that as this. But yeah, if the Talmud says this seems to contradict with that, and then the Talmud says no, the first one, the reason it's in a specific type of case, a specific type of context, and that's why over there it said that. It's a perfect example. So it's a little bit deep.
I'm not following this point. What do you think he's referring to when he says it because of a certain necessity, something hasn't been stated in detail or stated properly? What kind of necessity is he talking about?
Sometimes the necessity is just brevity, or clarity. We might, I don't fully, to be honest, know myself exactly what he means, but we will get a little better of an idea in soon after we read through the 7 causes, the 7 types of contradictions. He's going to explain what he's going to give examples of what he means, and we'll understand it better. So, but for whatever reason, when the statement was first made, it was made in a way that left some things out for some reason. And it's a good question, and I don't fully understand the answer myself, but I think we'll get a little better idea as we read when he describes examples of the fourth type. Okay, I'm sorry I didn't fully answer it, but we will get a little bit better understanding. The fifth type, right? And I'm going to explain before I read it what he basically means, and that is that sometimes you're explaining a complex idea to a person, and you give him or her some premises which may not be true, but they help the person along the path to understanding a more complex idea. So you say, let's say, X is this, let's assume that this and this is true. And then you use that to get to a more important idea. That, let's say, that idea that you started with was not really true, but you were using it simply to build an argument and to explain what you're trying to actually say. So in these kind of cases is, so if a person, again, looks at the externals of it, they'll think that you said something that wasn't true and that contradicts something else, but you really didn't mean it. You really just used that as a building block of a larger argument. So the fifth cause arises from the necessity of teaching and making someone understand. For there may be a certain obscure matter that is difficult to conceive, something that's hard to explain. One has to mention it or to take it as a premise in explaining something that is easy to conceive and that by rights ought to be taught before the former. This one always begins with what is easier. So start off with something easier, and the teacher accordingly will have to be lax, using any means that occur to him or gross speculation. And he'll try to make the first matter somehow understood, but he will not undertake to state the matter as it truly is in exact terms, but rather he will leave it so in accord with the listener's imagination that the latter will understand only what he now wants him to understand. So he throws out a fact or an idea that is not really true, but he's using it as a building block to bring him, to bring his student or whoever he's teaching to some other understanding. Afterwards, in the appropriate place, that obscure matter is stated in exact terms and explained it as truly is, and it seems like a contradiction, but it really isn't. In other words, the person that said that fact really didn't mean it as a fact. He or she meant it as a means to explain a more complex idea. The sixth type of contradiction, and this is, I'll explain it in my own words before I read it, is a place where there's a real contradiction, but if you don't think about it, and here's where the Rambam starts to fire his weapons at scholars that he didn't think very highly of. In other words, they're writing things that actually contradict each other, but because they're not thinking deeply about what it is that they're saying, they don't realize that it contradicts each other because the contradictions aren't on the surface. But if you really analyze it closely, you say, in order to believe A, you have to also believe B, C, D, and E, right? And in order to believe X, you have to believe Y, Z, and so on. So, and those things contradict each other. Now, I'm sure we can all think of examples of where, and Rabbi Kapach in his commentary in the Hebrew version, he kind of winks and says, I can give you a lot of examples, but I don't want to insult anybody, you know, and that, so the contradictions aren't on the surface. When you read the two facts, they seem to be, okay, they could make sense. But if you follow the premises that are necessary in order to come to those conclusions, you'll realize that these two things can't possibly coexist. They have to be contradictory. I'm thinking of skipping the Rambam's words and just having you trust me on that one. That's how he explains the sixth one. He does say at the end, if people that do this, and there's many books of people that do this, it's a great weakness, and that man should not be reckoned among those whose speeches deserve consideration. So when you read somebody that says things like that, you know, just forget about him. I'm not bothering with this guy. Then the seventh type is the place where a contradiction is I'll read the Rambam's words here from Pines, from the English. The seventh type is in speaking about very obscure matters, it is necessary to conceal some parts and to disclose others. Sometimes things are very difficult to understand, and purposefully certain things are left out. And sometimes in the case of certain dicta, this necessity requires that the discussion proceed on the basis of a certain premise. Whereas in another place, necessity requires the discussion proceed on the basis of another premise, which contradicts the first one. So sometimes people deliberately choose contradictory ideas because it's so difficult to understand. This is very similar, and I don't fully get how this is different than the fifth one. But in such cases, and the only difference is that the seventh one, the vulgar must in no way be aware of the contradiction, where the contradiction is hidden. Someone who's not smart enough, the educator is not going to explain the contradiction because it's too deep. It's too much. It's too much for the average person to understand. So the author accordingly uses some device to conceal it by all means. So the author, basically, whoever's writing this book, or whoever's teaching this idea, deliberately leaves a contradiction in place, but tries to hide it so that you don't notice it. Now, I'm going to go into the way, I'm going to read Maimonides' explanation of where these 7 types of contradictions are used. So the contradictions that are to be found in the Mishnah and the Braito, so this goes to the Talmud, right? We all study Talmud together in the Daf Yomi, and if not, you should, and one day you will. And the Talmud is full of this, right? It says you'll find they constantly ask, doesn't the Resha conflict with the Seifa? The beginning of the Mishnah seems to be saying one thing, and the Seifa infers it says to be saying something else. And then often they'll say, oh no, this is the reason why the Resha says this, because it goes according to the opinion of this and this Tana, this and this rabbi. And the reason why the Seifa says that, because that goes according to the opinion of this and this one. So it's not really a contradiction. So that, or Rabbi agreed with the opinion of this rabbi here and the opinion of that rabbi there. Or you'll find who wrote this anonymous passage, even though it's written anonymously, it meant it's actually so-and-so wrote it. And who authored from so-and-so. Such cases are innumerable, Maimonides says, and any page of the Talmud, pretty much, you can just open it up and you'll find an example of this type of thing. So these are contradictions or divergences that are due to the first and the second causes, right? Either because the first one being their different opinions, and the second one being that they changed their mind. So you'll also find them saying, in this manner, he agreed with this one, or he agreed with them, or so on. All contradictions of this kind are due to the first cause. The second cause are Rav abandoned this opinion. I'm kind of speeding through this reading here. Or Rava abandoned this opinion. In other words, he's Hadar Ben Yahi. It's the language that Gemara often uses. He changes his mind. He was confronted with different evidence, different circumstances. He changed his mind. In such case, the only issue is finding out which was the original opinion and what did he change his mind to. And sometimes try to figure out why he changed his mind. But and that was that. But then, and I'm right now on the Pines, I'm in the middle of page 19, that some passages in every prophetic book, now he's jumping out of Azal, out of the Talmud, and jumping into the works of the prophets. Sometimes you'll find words in the books of the prophets, when taken in their external sense, appear to contradict or to be contrary to one another. That's usually due to either the third or fourth cause. And remember, the third and fourth cause are very similar, right? Where the third one being where the one or both were actually parables and not meant to be taken literally. And if you look at what they actually meant, then they're not contradictory. And the fourth one being, you need to delve beneath the surface, right? If you remember the fourth one, which I don't remember, for some reason or other, the verse left out a fact that was important. But if you then supply that extra fact, so then you would understand why it's why it's not really a contradiction. Thereupon, they explain that a proviso is lacking in the statement of the subject, or that the two texts have different subjects. So that would be how the more often found in the words of the prophets. And cases of this are also frequent in the sayings of the sages and the rabbis as well. However, most of the prophetic statements they refer to concern commandments or precepts regarding conduct. When you read the rabbis and they talk about these types of contradictions, and then they answer the contradictions by explaining different circumstances, usually, and this is what, wait, who was the one that made that comment about the fourth one? That's what he's saying here. So the rabbis are usually talking about Talmudic laws, right? And they're saying that this law over here, which sounds like the person would be obligated to pay in this case of damages, and this law that sounds like the person would not be obligated to pay. And then they answer and they say, well, this circumstance was when they're in the property of the victim, and this circumstance was when they're in public property, something like that, right? So those are typically the types of discussions we find in the Talmud. However, in this book, I'm looking at verses that are apparently contradictory. So I'd be talking about something like the issue of anthropomorphism, which is one of Maimonides' favorite issues, right? Or some other issue that seems to say a concept or an idea about God in one place that seems to mean one thing, another place it seems to mean the other, and I will then explain the difference by describing what it really meant beneath the surface. Now, part of this will be explained in some of the chapters of this treatise. That's what I'm going to spend my time on in this book. Now, whether contradictions due to the seventh cause are to be found in the books of the prophets, is a matter for speculative study and investigation. This I find to be a pretty interesting statement to the Rambam, because he says the seventh cause, if you remember, was where something is deliberately hidden because people can't understand it. And that, the Rambam is saying, I don't know how much I'm going to deal with that in this book. As for the divergences occurring in books of philosophers, or rather of those who know the truth, they are usually due to the fifth cause. Now, if you remember, the fifth cause was where they gave certain premises as building blocks of arguments, even though those premises weren't true. So if you're reading Plato or Aristotle, which is usually the two main philosophers Maimonides is referring to, they might use building blocks of arguments, even though those arguments are untrue, simply in order to prove their point or to say their point. On the other hand, the contradictions occurring in most of the books of authors and commentators other than those are due to the sixth cause. So anyone who's not a real good philosopher, who's really not a very good author, and is not even worth reading his book, like Maimonides said before, they are coming from the sixth cause. They have contradictions that they don't even know are contradictions because they didn't do the proper analysis. Most of the books of other authors, the Rambam just like wiped away. You know, those guys don't even bother. Likewise, and this is really, really fascinating, and one of the things that got the Rambam in trouble, in Midrashim and in Haggadah, meaning when you read the Aggadot of Chazal, when you go through the Gemara, and sometimes the Gemara goes off on non-law related topics, and the rabbis bring up subjects and issues that are all over the place, just expound on various ideas and notions, some of which sometimes are very contradictory. The Rambam says they may actually be contradictory, right? And they're kind of like what those other writers wrote, that, and if you look at the premises that lead up to the conclusions that are made, they are actually contradictory, but don't even bother answering those questions. That is why the sages have said no questions should be asked about difficulties in the Haggadah. If you have a stira, a contradiction in one Haggadah, in one Gemara, and another Haggadah in another, don't bother trying to answer it. It's not worth it. They might just contradict. By the way, this statement that Maimonides just quoted, why the sages have said, no one knows where the sages said this. It seems like a pretty glaring, pretty important clause, but we don't have any Chazal that actually says that. And none of the books that I have seen have actually found an actual source for the statement, but Maimonides puts it out there as if it was a statement of Chazal. There are also to be found contradictions due to the seventh cause, which, remember, those are the ones that are hidden because they're too hard for most people to understand. Divergences that are to be found in this treatise are due to the fifth cause and the seventh. So the other things that you might find in my book, right, in my book, it's either because of the fifth. In other words, either I might say a statement simply as a building block for an argument, or I might be hiding something that's contradictory because it's too much for people to understand. Know this, grasp its true meaning, and remember it very well so as not to become perplexed by some of its chapters. When you encounter issues in my book that seem contradictory, I'll get to you in a second. Just remember what I'm saying now, why those contradictions exist, and then you won't be perplexed. Then you'll understand what I'm doing. Let me finish because I have a tiny bit left,
Sure.
and then we'll open the floor to questions. After these introductory remarks, I shall now begin to mention the terms whose true meaning as intended in every passage according to its context must be indicated. This then will be a key to permitting one to enter places to the gates to which we're locked. So now the Rambam is saying, I'm about to start, and the way I'm going to start is I'm going to pick terms, right? Terms, typically terms that come up often both in the verses of the prophets and in Chazal. And I'm going to demonstrate the different meanings of those terms and how they could mean different things in different places, so that you have a key when you read the prophets and you come across these terms, you can now have a key to understand what exactly is really meant. And when these gates are opened and these places are entered into, the souls will find rest therein. You'll understand, as boring as it might seem to go into a discussion of the grammatical meaning of words, Maimonides tells us it's going to be a key. And I promise you that if we stick together through all this, and I hope we will, as we go through each set of words, you're going to realize how much value there is to this seemingly boring and mundane venture into what words mean, And then all of a sudden, you're going to start looking at the verses and say, wow, Maimonides really had something important to say here, because all of a sudden what you thought the verses might have meant might not mean exactly what you thought. And it'll blow you away, my mind, the way he uses that. The eyes will be delighted and the bodies will be eased of their toil and their labor. So we will have tremendous relief when we get those keys as we go through those words. And next time we study, we're going to start hitting on those words. And Maimonides is going to take words that sometimes words that seem to be contradictory, words that you think meant something but really could mean many things. And if you remember when he started, he told us different types of terms. He's going to analyze it using those different types of terms and so on. All right, now I'm going to open the floor. We're going to stop here this week, but the floor is open. All right, go ahead. I see one hand up.
Oh, so yeah, hi. Thanks, Shul. So are you saying that the Rambam is suggesting that within Tanakh there is necessarily internal consistency within Tanakh, and it's just, I shouldn't say just, it's a matter of elucidating to be able to understand, to be able to reconcile what are seeming inconsistencies in Tanakh?
I'm really glad you brought that up, actually, because yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, there's a second half, but I'll wait.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because that's important. Because yes, the Rambam did make a distinction between Tanakh and Chazal, and this is glaringly crucial. I mean, this is so important, and that Tanakh has to have this inherent consistency. And so he only allowed for this issue with Haggadah and allowing there to be inconsistencies when he talked about the words of the rabbis. The Rambam was okay to say that within Chazal there are inconsistencies and things we'll never be able to explain because they actually do contradict each other, which he said explicitly, right? However, within Tanakh, within the words of the prophets, there is an internal consistency, although he did admit that the seventh type of contradiction might be found in some places among the prophets, that where certain things might have been allowed to remain seemingly contradictory because the ideas and concepts behind it are so lofty that the average person wouldn't understand. But if you did, if you were not the average person and you worked on it, you'll find a consistency, you'll find an understanding. And I'm glad you pointed that out.
You answered the second half of the question that was hinted at by the first. So thank you.
Okay. Welcome.
I have a very simple, straightforward question.
Yes.
When the word Haggadah is used, that's not the Passover Haggadah, that's just the words of the rabbis.
Yeah. It's really, typically nowadays, most people, when they refer to it, would call it the Agada without the hey. But in Maimonides language, I have no idea what he actually wrote in the in Arabic because it was written in Arabic.
So it's just an Aggadic dispute or conversation between and among.
Yeah, right. So and there's much of that. Obviously, the Talmud does that all the time, and very often we find things that just and Maimonides says this on several occasions, but this is one of them. That if one of them doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense.
When the Rambam was talking about these constraints that might have caused people not to explicate something fully, something that occurred to me, although maybe it wasn't true at his time, is that things were sometimes not written explicitly by the rabbis because if the writings fell into the hands of the secular authorities, it could cause problems for the Jews. So some things were stated a little obscurely. Is that the sort of thing that you think he might have been referring to?
I think that that's an interesting question. I don't get the sense from reading Maimonides that was a big deal to him, like being afraid of what the authorities have to say. I wonder if that had to do with, the Maimonides' circumstance at the time was he was very high up in the secular authorities and the government of his time and respected by them as well. Like he was the head physician for the Sultan himself. He had access to the Sultan, Maimonides himself. So I don't know how.
If he was trying to explain contradictions in writings many centuries before,
Maybe he would have used that. I'm not familiar with the Rambam using that argument very often about people being afraid of. The Rambam was certainly aware of a lot of the persecution going on in his time, and that people were afraid of things like, so for example, he addressed in many occasions, the status of people who convert to Islam under duress and things like that. But in terms of his intellectual writings, I don't know. I mean, maybe he does. I don't come across that much. It seems to me like he's more afraid of people misunderstanding, and maybe rabbis hiding things because they were afraid they would be misunderstood. He was more afraid of other Jews claiming that he was a heretic than he was afraid of the in his case, the Islamic authorities. I mean, there was Christians in his day, but he was much more afraid of the Muslims.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Go ahead.
I do. I have. I've read that Maimonides was somewhat Aristotelian, or somewhat owing to Aristotle, and Aristotle was had a frame for reasoning. It's called the syllogism. The syllogism consisted of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. The major premise might be all men are mortal. Maimonides is a man, therefore Maimonides is mortal. It seems to me that these contradictions that I haven't really studied this, but it just seems to me that these contradictions are maybe somehow not consistent. I mean, I don't know. First of all, can you draw anything from the Aristotelian concept of deductive reasoning from a major?
Well, the idea that the final statement that someone makes rests upon a series of premises that lead up to that conclusion, it really underlies everything Maimonides just said about contradictions. That two conclusions might not look contradictory, but if you look at the premises that build up to them, then you see that they have to be contradictory, or the opposite. Two conclusions might look contradictory, but when you look at the premises that led up to them, you realize that they're actually not contradictory. And we'll see the Rambam will go through a process that's very similar to Aristotle, like you just described. As we go through the book, he's going to go off on several occasions. He's going to go off into very Aristotelian style explanations of things. I personally am not an expert in Aristotle. I don't claim to be an expert in much of anything, but I try when Maimonides quotes as best as I can to read up on Aristotle, just so that I can understand what Rambam is saying. But there are people out there that study that aspect of Maimonides' works and really comparing him to Aristotle and the way the Islamic world at his time understood Aristotle, because that's the prism through which Maimonides studied Aristotle. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
well, I was generally interested in to what extent he was influenced by Aristotle.
Well, Maimonides says repeatedly, and we'll get there. I mean, he tells us that Aristotle is basically the truth. With a few exceptions where Maimonides explicitly states his disagreements with Aristotle, Maimonides accepted Aristotle as the ultimate authority. He's very, very highly influenced by Aristotle. And among many other things, Maimonides is famous for saying that Aristotle shows that you don't need to keep the Torah to be a perfect human being. That Aristotle achieved perfection, intellectual perfection, even without using the Torah. Now that opens up a whole subject of discussion, which is way too long because we're already over our time. But that's one of the famous things that he said. And yeah, so he definitely was very much influenced by him.
Thank you. I'll reserve, since we're over time, I'll reserve any future questions on the subject, another
Um,
occasion.
Any-
Well, I just
Go
I
ahead.
just have two quick biographical questions, and you may not want to get into this now, but one is, I thought that at one point in Maimonides' life, he needed to flee from one country to another because of persecution.
Absolutely, yeah. When he was young, and it's controversial when. The conventional wisdom that he was 9 years old when his family had to run from Cordoba, Spain, right? And they had to run because of the Almohads. They're like a very fun, very what we'd call today the Al Qaeda of his day, and they invaded southern Spain and overran where they lived, and his family had to get up and run. Recent scholarship debates, they think he might actually been a lot older. Some say that he might have been in his 20s when he left, but the conventional wisdom is that he was a young boy, but he's old enough to remember. But they definitely did run, and that's why they left Spain. And then they ran across North Africa, eventually making their way to Palestine, and then eventually making their way from Palestine to Egypt. And then in Egypt, where he spent his most productive years of his life.
I was in Fez, and he studied in Fez at the oldest university in the world. And I think I read that there's at least a theory that for a period of his time, he had converted or seemed to have converted to Islam. Do you have a view on that?
I've heard of it. I've seen writings about it. I know that in the Islamic world, they take it as a matter of fact that Maimonides, in the end of his life, converted to Islam.
At the end of his life.
Or well, that they say that he converted. They say they have all kinds of names for him, and he, as far as Muslims are concerned, Maimonides was a Muslim. Now, what I don't know enough about the evidence to tell you, what I think. I find it exceedingly bizarre to imagine that Maimonides, who literally devoted, most of his, almost so much of his published writings to specifically refuting Islam, and a person who embodies Judaism more than almost any other human being in history would have converted to Islam. Now, whether or not he played with the possibility, because Maimonides was so incredibly intellectually honest, and so incredibly devoted to searching for the truth, I wouldn't be surprised at all that he explored that option, simply because he wanted to know the truth and live the truth. And if Islam was there and presented itself as the truth, he's the kind of person who would have analyzed, who would have really seriously looked into it, like honestly looked into it, not just to refute it, but to really know it. And we know, and we'll find in this book, he spends a lot of time discussing the Mutakalamun. I remember he mentioned it in his original letter, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but and this was a Muslim sect that Maimonides clearly admired their thought, but also in this book refutes them on numerous occasions. So I wouldn't be surprised if he maybe even went to some Muslim schools and sat and learned there and tried to figure out, that's probably where it comes from, but that's my only response.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else have a question or comment? And believe that, or I'll see if I can find more information about that, but.
At least the way I learned it, and it was presented as, there was no doubt that he studied in a madrasa in Fez. That didn't seem to be controversial, that he did.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. If someone like him who truly devoted to truth, he would have been the person who he would have done that. That just makes sense.
Well, and his family also routinely fled to Muslim countries, right? Because they were tolerant. There were good relationships between intolerance. So there's a reason that they continued to do so.
Well, yes
Yeah.
and no. So the Almadahars or whatever it was were also Muslim, and they were not so friendly.
They were
to
not
the
very
Jews.
tolerant at all. Yeah. The Muslims Maimonides was close to it in most of his life were tolerant Muslims, not the ones that he ran away from were, like you said, not. Any any other things? If not, I'm gonna call it close. I'm glad I remembered to record this one. And next week, we look forward to starting the meat of the book. We're done with the introductions, so we're gonna get into the juice. All right, so everyone have a wonderful evening, and thank you very much
Thank you.
for joining. You all.
Thank
Many
you.
thanks,
Good
Saul.
night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.